If you, like me, are from a Western country, you probably don't know too much about the independence of India, or you might know a whitewashed version of events. That is certainly the case for me, as the Mexican education system certainly didn't teach me shit about it. So let's talk a little bit about it and see what we can learn. Also, if you're from like India or an actual historian, you are very much welcome to add something or correct anything I say. Anyways, let's get started. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, there were many conflicts between European colonial powers over control of the Indian subcontinent, each country trying to expand their influence in the region to secure trade routes and resources. By the 19th century, through military and economic power, England gained control of the country and established their own government in India, which would be known as the British Raj. England greatly benefited from this, as they now had a sea route connecting Europe and the Far East countries, cheap manpower to produce all sorts of goods and access to the region's vast resources, all of which would make them tons and tons of money. However, the living conditions for the native Indians only got worse. Poverty, poor working conditions, religious and cultural assimilation, and the lack of government representation were some of the problems they were facing under British rule, and discontent soon started to grow. At the start of the 20th century, there were violent confrontations between the British Army and Indian nationalists, which only gave the British more excuses to increase the military presence in the country and crack down on civil rights. Seeing how the situation in his country was only getting worse, a man named Gandhi, we all know him, decided to try a different approach. He started to unite people and lead them to face the British rule through peaceful protests in response to their violence. Now, if you don't know too well how all of this went down, you might think that these protests were like just a bunch of hippies singing about peace or whatever, but the actual actions they took were actually pretty impressive. Besides regular protests and marches, they also engaged in boycotting British goods and non-compliance and disobedience to British authorities. At the same time, they would promote Indian culture and self-governing bodies independent from British rule, all actions that would destabilize the rule without using violence. This went on for a while, with the protests escalating and Britain losing more and more political and economical power in the region. By the end of World War II, Britain was pretty much broke. They ran out of money and resources to keep their colonies in check. By this time, the anti-British sentiment was at an all-time high. The desire for self-governance was stronger than ever, and violence was even starting to erupt once again in many regions, which would show some of the cracks in Gandhi's pacifist ideologies, but we'll talk about it in a minute. This all led to Britain conceding India their independence in 1947. Of course, this wasn't the end of the fight, as another conflict was about to start in the region. But first, there's something I was curious about before doing my research, and that you might also be curious about. That is, why was Gandhi's pacifist movement successful in kicking out their colonizers? Well, there are actually many reasons. One of the main factors was that, due to it being a movement without violence, anyone could join, no matter the age, gender, and physical capability. Another action he took was to raise awareness and educate people about the issues that were affecting them, which would also attract people of different ethnicities and ideologies to join in on the protests with a common goal. This created a situation where anyone, no matter who you were, could join the movement and do their part without endangering themselves. The movement grew more and more, and slowly but steadily, it started to weaken the British rule, all while creating a framework for a country after the British left. Many other counter-movements around the world praised Gandhi's ideologies and implemented versions of them into their causes. However, when it came time to govern India after the British left, it became clear that they weren't gonna work. While people of different religions and ethnicities united to free themselves of British rule, There were underlying conflicts between these groups. There were disputes on how to govern themselves and which land belonged to whom. With rising tensions both inside and outside the country, it was decided that the country was gonna be partitioned for Hindus and Muslims. Gandhi was of the belief that coexistence between religions in a single country was possible, and opposed partition, believing it would only cause violence. However, no matter how much he protested, he was politically outmatched by the British and those who called for partition. His message of unity no longer resonated with the people who once fought under it, and angered some of the more radical people, which would lead to his assassination in 1948. Gandhi's prediction came true. The partition of India ended up creating a violent conflict between India and Pakistan, a conflict that has caused millions of deaths and that lasts to this day. Seeing how all of this turned out, I do wonder myself if this conflict could have been avoided. At the time, the world was in turmoil, with World War II having just ended, the Cold War just starting, and the Soviet Union and China as neighbors. It's understandable why there was so much tension in a country like India. Do you think that if the circumstances were different, this conflict could have been avoided? Or if Gandhi had had more political prowess, he could have resolved it better? Personally, I don't know. I'm not very smart, but I'm kind of curious what other people think. Regardless of how this turned out, I am still a firm believer in pacifism, and seeing how Gandhi's ideologies influence our current forms of protests is actually very interesting. And if you're also into pacifism, I hope they were interesting for you too. There are many movements around the world that were inspired by him, and I hope I get to talk about them another day.